The cold barrel of the rifle lay across Matthew York's lap, gathering dust and rust, just like the memories he tried so hard to bury. The weapon hadn't been fired in nearly 2 years, not since that fateful day when his brother Jacob fell at Wounded Knee. The winter of 1892 had settled over Shoshone, Wyoming, with an unforgiving chill, much like the one that had taken residence in Matthew's heart. The saloon was quiet for a Thursday evening, just the occasional clink of glasses and muffled conversations floating through the tobacco-hazed air. Matthew nursed his whiskey, feeling the familiar burn down his throat as he contemplated the weapon that had once been an extension of his arm. Now it was nothing but a painful reminder. "Another?" the bartender asked, nodding at Matthew's empty glass. "No," Matthew replied, rising from his seat. "Think I'll call it a night." The cold hit him like a physical force as he stepped outside, pulling his sheepskin coat tighter around his broad shoulders. At 32, Matthew York had the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life under the harsh western sun. His dark hair, usually hidden beneath his wide-brimmed hat, had begun to show threads of silver at the temples, not from age but from grief. The walk to his small ranch on the outskirts of town was familiar enough that his boots seemed to find their own way, crunching through the thin layer of snow that had fallen earlier in the day. The rifle hung loosely in his hand, a dead weight he couldn't seem to put down despite its disuse. As he approached his property, he noticed a light in the window of his cabin, a light he certainly hadn't left burning. Matthew's hand instinctively tightened around the rifle before he remembered the firing pin had been removed months ago. Another reminder of the promise he'd made at Jacob's grave: no more killing. Cautiously approaching his own front door, he heard movement inside. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, ready to confront whoever had invaded his home. The sight before him was nothing he could have prepared for. A woman stood by his fireplace, stoking the dying embers back to life. She turned at the sound of his entrance, her green eyes widening slightly before a smile touched her lips. "Mr. York," she said, her voice calm despite the clear intrusion. "I apologize for entering your home uninvited. Your neighbor, Mrs. Sullivan, let me in when I explained who I was." Matthew stood frozen in the doorway, the cold at his back and confusion on his face. "And who exactly are you?" "Grace Remington," she replied, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "Jacob's fiancée." The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. Jacob had mentioned a woman in his letters, but he'd never said they were engaged. "That's not possible," Matthew finally managed. "Jacob never, it was recent," Grace interrupted, her voice softening. "Just before." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Matthew finally stepped fully into the cabin, closing the door behind him. He placed the rifle on the table, noticing her eyes following the movement. "I've come a long way to meet you, Mr. York," Grace continued. "Jacob spoke of you often in his letters." Matthew studied her more carefully now. She was dressed practically for travel, her clothes of good quality but not ostentatious. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, despite the obvious fatigue of her journey. "Where have you come from?" he asked, still suspicious. "Boston," she replied. "I would have come sooner, but it took some time to settle my father's affairs after his passing." Matthew gestured to the small table. "Sit, Miss Remington. I think we have much to discuss." Over the next hour, Grace told him about her relationship with Jacob, how they'd met when he'd traveled east on business, their correspondence, and finally, his proposal just weeks before he joined Matthew for what was supposed to be a short stint as a scout for the cavalry. A stint that had ended at Wounded Knee Creek. "I have his letters," she said, reaching into her bag and producing a bundle tied with twine. "And this." She opened her palm to reveal a simple gold band. "He'd sent it to me, saying he'd place it properly on my finger when he returned." The sight of the ring finally broke through Matthew's skepticism. It had belonged to their mother, and Jacob had taken it with him when they'd parted ways. "Why are you here?" Matthew asked bluntly. Grace's eyes met his, unwavering. "Jacob wrote that if anything happened to him, I should find you. He said you would help me." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming him. "Help you how? I'm barely helping myself these days." "I need a fresh start," Grace explained. "Boston holds nothing for me now. Jacob said you had land opportunity. He said you were a good man. Matthew let out a bitter laugh. Jacob always did see the best in people, even when it wasn't there. He also said you were stubborn, Grace added with the hint of a smile, and that you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders even when you didn't have to. For the first time in 2 years, Matthew felt something other than grief or numbness, annoyance, perhaps, at this woman who spoke as if she knew him. But there was something else too, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. You can stay the night, he said finally. I'll sleep in the stable. Tomorrow we can discuss what to do. Grace nodded, seemingly satisfied with this arrangement. Thank you, Mr. York. Matthew, he corrected automatically. If you're going to be staying in my home, even for a night, you might as well use my name. As he gathered a blanket to take to the stable, he noticed her looking at the rifle again. Your brother's? She asked quietly. Matthew shook his head. Mine, but I made a promise at Jacob's grave. He left the cabin before she could respond, the cold air a welcome relief from the uncomfortable warmth that had begun to build inside him, the first spark of something he'd thought long dead. The night passed slowly in the stable, with only his horse Samson for company. Matthew found sleep elusive, his thoughts circling around the woman in his cabin and the ghost that had brought her there. When dawn broke, he found Grace already awake, a pot of coffee brewing over the fire she'd carefully maintained through the night. You're an early riser, he commented, accepting the cup she offered. Farm daughter, she explained. Old habits. Matthew nodded, taking a sip of the coffee stronger and better than he usually made it. About your situation, he began. Shoshone's a small town, but there might be work at the general store or perhaps teaching. The schoolmaster's wife is expecting, and they've been looking for someone to take her place when the time comes. I was hoping, Grace said carefully, that there might be work here. Matthew nearly choked on his coffee. Here, at my ranch. It's not much of a ranch from what I can see, Grace replied with frank assessment. But Jacob said you had plans for expansion for cattle and crops. I grew up on a farm, Mr. York. Matthew. I'm no stranger to hard work. It's not appropriate, Matthew argued. A single woman living on a man's property. I'll stay in town if propriety is your concern, Grace countered. But I meant what I said about a fresh start. I don't want charity. I want to earn my way, and I believe I can help make your brother's dreams for this land come true. Matthew set down his cup, studying her with narrowed eyes. You're very forward, Miss Remington. Grace, she corrected with a small smile. And yes, I've been told that before. Usually not as a compliment. Despite himself, Matthew felt his lips twitch toward a smile. I'll think about it. In the meantime, I'll take you into town. You can stay at the boarding house while we figure things out. Later that morning, as they rode toward town on his wagon, Matthew caught Grace looking at the rifle again. He'd brought it along, intending to drop it off at the gunsmith to see if the rust could be removed. Why keep it if you don't use it? She asked, breaking the companionable silence that had fallen between them. Matthew considered the question longer than it probably deserved. It's all I have left of who I was, he finally said. Even if I don't like that person much anymore. Grace nodded, her eyes on the horizon. Jacob said you were the best shot in 3 counties, said you could hit a can at 50 paces with your eyes closed. Jacob exaggerated, Matthew replied, though a flicker of pride warmed his chest at the memory. He also said you were the most honorable man he'd ever known, Grace continued. That part, I believe he got right. Matthew had no response to that, so he focused on the road ahead, trying to ignore the curious looks from townsfolk as they rode down the main street with a new face beside him, Mrs. Sullivan, the neighbor who'd let Grace into his cabin, was outside the general store and waved enthusiastically. Matthew groaned internally, knowing the town gossip would be working overtime by nightfall. Your neighbor seems friendly, Grace observed with a hint of amusement. Too friendly, Matthew muttered. She'll have us married with 3 children by supper time. Grace laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the crisp morning air. Well, that would solve the propriety issue, wouldn't it? Matthew gave her a sidelong glance, surprised by her humor. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of what Jacob might have seen in her, not just her pretty face, but a spirit that seemed undimmed by grief and hardship. After arranging Grace's stay at the boarding house, Matthew reluctantly introduced her to a few townspeople, including the schoolmaster and his wife. As he'd predicted, they were eager to meet with her about possibly taking over the teaching position. "You didn't mention you were educated," Matthew said as they walked toward the gunsmith's shop. "You didn't ask," Grace replied simply. "My father believed in education for both his daughters. My sister chose marriage, I chose books." "Until Jacob," Matthew said. A shadow crossed Grace's face. "Yes, until Jacob. He was the one man who seemed to value my mind as much as anything else." The gunsmith, Harold Miller, looked up as they entered his shop. His eyes widened at the sight of Grace, then narrowed knowingly at Matthew. "Brought company, York?" he asked with a sly grin. "Miss Remington is new to town," Matthew said stiffly. "She was acquainted with my brother." Harold's expression sobered immediately. "My condolences, miss. Jacob was a fine man." "Thank you," Grace replied quietly. Matthew placed the rifle on the counter. "Can you do anything about the rust, Harold?" The gunsmith examined the weapon with a professional eye. "Haven't seen you with this in a while. Thought maybe you'd retired from shooting altogether." "Just taking a break," Matthew said. Aware of Grace's eyes on him, Harold nodded. "I can clean her up good as new. Take a few days, though." "No rush," Matthew assured him. As they left the shop, Grace asked, "Why have it fixed if you don't intend to use it?" Matthew sighed. "Just because I made a promise doesn't mean I need to let a good rifle go to waste. Someone might need it someday." Grace seemed to accept this explanation, though Matthew wasn't sure he believed it himself. The days turned into weeks, and despite Matthew's initial reservations, he found himself growing accustomed to Grace's presence in Shoshone. She had taken the teaching position temporarily, but spent her free days helping at Matthew's ranch. True to her word, she was no stranger to hard work, and her suggestions for improving the property were often practical and insightful. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it new possibilities. Matthew found himself implementing plans he and Jacob had once discussed: expanding the cattle herd, planting crops in the fertile section of his land, and repairing the long-neglected barn. And though he was reluctant to admit it, Grace's presence had become a catalyst for this renewal. On a particularly warm day in April, Matthew returned from town to find Grace in the field behind the cabin, her skirts hiked up practically as she dug in the soil. "What are you doing?" he called. Dismounting from Samson, Grace straightened, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Planting a garden. Mrs. Sullivan gave me some seedlings." Matthew approached, examining the neat rows she'd created. "You don't need to do this. You already have enough work with the school and helping with the cattle." Grace placed her hands on her hips, fixing him with a determined look. "A fresh vegetable garden will save you money and provide better meals, unless you enjoy salt pork and beans every night." Matthew couldn't help the smile that tugged at his lips. "You making a comment about my cooking, Miss Remington?" "I wouldn't dare," she replied, the twinkle in her green eyes belying her innocent tone. "Though I did notice you've gained some weight since I started helping with meals." Matthew found himself laughing, the sound unfamiliar to his own ears. "Are you calling me fat now?" "Not fat," Grace corrected, her smile widening. "Just less gaunt. It suits you." The compliment caught him off guard, and he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun. Clearing his throat, he gestured to the wagon. "I picked up my rifle from Harold. Good as new, apparently, though I haven't checked it myself." Grace followed him to the wagon, watching as he unwrapped the cloth that protected the weapon. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, all traces of rust removed. "It's beautiful workmanship," she observed, running a finger lightly along the stock. "It was my father's," Matthew said quietly. "He gave it to me when I was 16, said a man needed a reliable rifle out here." And was he right? Matthew thought about the question, about the times the rifle had saved his life and the times it had taken others. Yes, but not in the way he meant. A rifle doesn't make a man. Sometimes it just makes it easier to forget you are one. Grace's eyes softened with understanding. "Jacob told me about some of the things you both did during the war. He carried his own regrets." "Did he tell you about Wounded Knee?" Matthew asked, his voice hardening. "Did he tell you it wasn't a battle but a massacre? He told me enough," Grace interrupted gently. "He also told me how you tried to stop it, how you refused orders and tried to protect the women and children." Matthew shook his head. Not soon enough, not well enough. Is that why you put down your rifle? Because of what happened there? Matthew carefully rewrapped the weapon, unable to meet her eyes. I made a promise at Jacob's grave, no more killing, not by my hand. A noble promise, Grace said, but perhaps not a practical one in a place like this. Maybe not, Matthew conceded, but it's all I have left to give him. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Grace broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. I received an offer today, she said. The schoolmaster's wife had her baby last week, a healthy boy. They've asked me to take over permanently. Matthew felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her having a reason to stay in town. Over the past weeks, her presence at the ranch had become something he looked forward to, even if he wasn't ready to examine why. That's good news, he said, keeping his voice neutral. You're good with the children, they respect you. Grace nodded, her eyes on the distant mountains. It's a good position. Steady work, my own room at the schoolhouse. You'll be taking it then? Matthew asked, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. I'm considering it, Grace replied. But I've also been thinking about our arrangement here. The ranch is coming along well, but there's still so much to do, and with the new cattle arriving next month. Matthew turned to look at her, noticing how the fading light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. What are you proposing? A partnership, Grace said firmly. I invest my savings in the ranch, become a proper business partner rather than just help. I could still teach, but this place, she gestured to the land around them. This was Jacob's dream too, I'd like to see it realized. The offer stunned Matthew. Your savings? Grace, I couldn't possibly, it's not charity, she cut in, it's business. I've seen your ledgers, Matthew. With proper investment and management, this ranch could be profitable within a year. Matthew stood, pacing the length of the porch. It's not just about the money, people will talk. A single woman investing in a single man's property, people already talk, Grace pointed out with a pragmatic shrug. Mrs. Sullivan still has us married with 3 children, I believe. Despite his concerns, Matthew laughed. 4 now, actually. She mentioned twins last time I was in town. Grace joined his laughter, the sound mingling with the evening breeze. Well then, what's a business partnership compared to fictional twins? Matthew stopped pacing, studying her face in the dying light. You're serious about this? I'm always serious about business, Matthew, she replied. And I'm serious about honoring Jacob's memory by helping his brother achieve the dream they shared. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of a bond that had formed, built on shared grief, but growing into something else entirely. I'll think about it, Matthew finally said. That's all I can promise for now. Grace seemed satisfied with that answer, and they fell back into companionable silence as darkness settled over the ranch. The following weeks brought significant changes to Shoshone and to Matthew's ranch. Spring cattle drives brought new business to town, and with Grace's investment, Matthew was able to purchase additional stock and hire 2 ranch hands to help with the expanding operation. Grace split her time between teaching and the ranch, somehow managing both with an energy that Matthew found both impressive and exhausting. Her presence had become a constant in his life, a steady force pulling him back from the brink of the isolation he'd been sinking into after Jacob's death. It was during a particularly busy day in late May, when trouble arrived at the ranch in the form of 3 riders Matthew recognized all too well. Former cavalrymen who'd been at Wounded Knee men who'd followed orders without question and had seemed to relish the bloodshed. Matthew was mending a fence when they approached, their horses kicking up dust that caught the afternoon sun. Well, look who it is, called the lead rider, a man named Curtis with a scar running down his left cheek. Matthew York, playing farmer. Matthew straightened slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Curtis, Thompson, Wilkins, what brings you to my property? Curtis dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. Heard you were doing well for yourself. Thought we'd come pay our respects to a fellow soldier. I'm not a soldier anymore, Matthew said evenly. Haven't been for a long time. Thompson, a burly man with a thick mustache, spat on the ground. Once a soldier, always a soldier, unless you've gone soft. Matthew ignored the taunt, keeping his face neutral despite the tension building in his shoulders. "State your business or move on. I've got work to do." Wilkins, the youngest of the three and the quietest, finally spoke. "We're looking for work, York. Heard you've been hiring." "Not hiring anymore," Matthew replied. "Positions are filled." Curtis took a step closer, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "That's not very hospitable, especially to men who served with you who know what you've done." The threat was thinly veiled, and Matthew felt a cold anger rising in his chest. "I said I'm not hiring. Now get off my land." "Or what?" Curtis challenged, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. "You going to make us? I don't see that famous rifle of yours anywhere." Before Matthew could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. York, is everything all right?" Grace approached from the direction of the cabin, her skirts swishing against the tall grass. She carried a basket, likely containing the lunch she often brought out to him while he worked. Curtis's attention immediately shifted to Grace, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made Matthew's blood boil. "Well now, who's this pretty little thing?" Curtis asked, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "You've been keeping secrets, York." "Miss Remington is my business partner," Matthew said firmly, moving to place himself between Grace and the three men. "And as I was just explaining, we're not hiring." Grace's expression remained composed, though Matthew could see the wariness in her eyes. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid Mr. York is correct. Our operation is fully staffed at present. However, I believe the Carson ranch over in Bitter Creek might be looking for experienced hands." Curtis ignored her suggestion, his focus still predatory. "Business partner, huh? That what they're calling it these days?" Thompson and Wilkins chuckled, and Matthew took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. "You've worn out your welcome. Leave now before I forget my manners entirely." For a tense moment, Matthew thought Curtis might draw his pistol. Instead, the scarred man spat on the ground near Matthew's boots. "This ain't over, York," he said quietly. "We've got unfinished business, you and me." With that, the three men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and unease in their wake. Who were they? Grace asked once they were out of earshot. Matthew watched their retreating figures, a sense of foreboding settling over him. "Men from my past, men who were at Wounded Knee." Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Will they be trouble?" "Yes," Matthew answered honestly, "but not today." That evening, after the ranch hands had gone home and dinner was cleared away, Matthew found himself standing before the cabinet where he kept his father's rifle. He hadn't touched it since bringing it back from the gunsmith, but Curtis's visit had awakened something in him, a sense of imminent danger. "Are you going to open it?" Grace asked from behind him. Matthew didn't turn around. "I'm thinking about it. Because of those men." "They're dangerous, Grace," Matthew said, finally facing her. "Curtis especially. He was reprimanded after Wounded Knee for excessive force, but it should have been much worse. He enjoys hurting people." Grace moved closer, her face serious in the lamplight. "And you think they'll come back?" "I know they will," Matthew replied. "Men like that, they don't let go of grudges, and Curtis blames me for the reprimand that ended his military career." "Then perhaps it's time to reconsider your promise," Grace suggested gently. "Jacob wouldn't want you defenseless if there's real danger." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, conflict evident in his expression. "It's not just about defense, Grace. It's about who I become with that rifle in my hands. I've done things, I know," Grace interrupted, stepping close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. "Jacob told me enough that I understand why you made your promise. But he also told me you were a good man, Matthew York. That doesn't change whether you're holding a rifle or a plow." Her words struck him deeply, challenging the narrative he'd constructed for himself after Wounded Knee. What if the darkness he feared wasn't in the rifle but in how he'd used it? What if putting it down hadn't changed anything fundamental about who he was? "I'll think about it," he finally said. Echoing his response to her partnership proposal weeks earlier, Grace smiled, recognizing his words. "You seem to do a lot of thinking, Mr. York. Comes from spending too much time alone," he replied with a small smile of his own. "Well, you're not alone anymore," Grace said simply. "Good night, Matthew." As she turned to leave, Matthew caught her hand. The gesture surprised them both, but he didn't let go. "Thank you," he said quietly, For everything you've done here, for bringing life back to this place." Grace's eyes softened, and for a moment, Matthew thought she might step closer. Instead, she squeezed his hand once before gently pulling away. "You're welcome. Now get some rest. Tomorrow is another busy day." After she left for her small room off the kitchen, Matthew opened the cabinet and took out the rifle. The weight of it was familiar in his hands, a connection to his past that he'd been avoiding. He checked the firing mechanism, finding it clean and functional thanks to Harold's work. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he placed it back in the cabinet without loading it. Not yet, he thought. But soon, perhaps. June brought scorching heat to Wyoming, turning the landscape golden and dry. The ranch prospered despite the challenging conditions, with the cattle growing fat on the summer grass and the garden producing enough vegetables to sell the excess in town. Grace's dual role as teacher and rancher had raised eyebrows initially, but the people of Shoshone had gradually accepted the unusual arrangement. It helped that Matthew had begun attending church services again, sitting beside Grace in the small white building that served as both chapel and meeting hall. On a particularly hot Sunday after services, Sheriff Thomas Miller approached them as they prepared to head back to the ranch. "York," he greeted with a nod. "Miss Remington, got a moment?" Matthew felt a flutter of concern. "What can we do for you, Sheriff?" Miller glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Had some trouble over in Bitter Creek last night. Bar fight turned ugly. 3 men killed the barkeeper when he tried to throw them out." "Let me guess," Matthew said grimly. "Curtis, Thompson, and Wilkins." Miller's eyebrows rose. "You know them. They paid us a visit a few weeks back," Matthew explained. "Looking for work, they said." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Well, they're wanted men now. Thought you should know, given your history with them. Curtis was asking about you in Bitter Creek before the trouble started." Grace's hand found Matthew's arm, her grip tight. "Do you think they'll come here?" "It's possible," Miller admitted. "These types, they don't think straight when there's blood in the water, and from what I hear, Curtis has had it in for you since the Army, York." Matthew nodded, his decision already made. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff." "I'd offer to send a deputy out to keep an eye on your place," Miller continued, "but with the cattle drives coming through, we're stretched thin as it is." "We'll manage," Matthew assured him, though his mind was already racing with preparations. As they drove back to the ranch, Grace was uncharacteristically quiet, her usual vibrant presence subdued by the sheriff's news. "You're worried," Matthew observed, glancing at her profile. "Shouldn't I be?" she replied. 3 killers may be coming for you, Matthew." "They may not," he countered, though he didn't believe it himself. "They might head north, try to lose themselves in Montana territory." Grace turned to face him fully. "And if they don't, if they come here," Matthew's hands tightened on the reins, "then I'll be ready." That evening, after ensuring the ranch hands would stay on the property for the night as an extra precaution, Matthew finally removed the rifle from its cabinet. He cleaned it thoroughly, despite Harold's recent work, and loaded it with practiced efficiency. The routine came back to him easily, muscle memory that hadn't faded despite the years of disuse. Grace watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. "Having it in your hands again?" Matthew considered the question, running his thumb along the smooth wooden stock. "Not strange, familiar, like greeting an old friend you've been avoiding because of a disagreement." "An apt metaphor," Grace said with a small smile, "though most disagreements don't involve promises made at graves." Matthew set the rifle aside, looking up at her. "Jacob would understand. He always was the practical one between us." "Tell me about him," Grace requested, settling into a chair across from him. "Not the Jacob from the letters, but the Jacob you grew up with." For the next hour, Matthew shared stories of their childhood hunting trips with their father, the time Jacob had fallen from the hayloft and broken his arm but still managed to finish his chores, the way he could charm anyone with his easy smile and genuine interest in their lives. "He sounds like the Jacob I knew," Grace said softly when Matthew finally fell silent. "Kind, determined, and utterly convinced that the world was fundamentally good despite evidence to the contrary." Matthew nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "He was the best of us, always was." "He thought the same of you," Grace replied. In every letter, he wrote of how proud he was of his older brother, how much he admired your principles, your courage. I wasn't worthy of that admiration, Matthew said, the old guilt resurfacing. Not after what happened. Grace leaned forward, her green eyes intent on his face. Jacob didn't blame you for Wounded Knee, Matthew. He blamed the system, the orders, the hatred that made it possible, but never you. He told you that, in his last letter, Grace confirmed. He wrote that you both had to find a way forward, to live with what you'd witnessed without letting it consume you. He was trying to find his path. I think he'd want you to find yours, too. Matthew felt something shift inside him, a weight he'd carried for so long beginning to lighten. And what do you think that path looks like, Grace? Her gaze was steady, unflinching. I think it looks like a man who honors his promise not by hiding from his past, but by using what he's learned to protect what matters now. The words hung between them, charged with meaning that extended beyond the immediate threat of Curtis and his companions. Matthew found himself standing, moving toward her with an urgency he couldn't explain. And what matters now? He asked, his voice low. Grace stood as well, the distance between them narrowing. This ranch, this life you're building, the future that's still possible. And you, Matthew added, his heart pounding. Do you matter in this future, Grace? For a moment she seemed unable to speak, her composure finally cracking to reveal the vulnerability beneath. I hope so, she whispered. I've come to care for this place and for its owner. Matthew reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. I never expected you, he admitted. Never thought I'd feel anything again after Jacob died, but you brought something back to life here and not just the ranch. Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I came here looking for Jacob's memory, for a connection to him. I never imagined I'd find. A sudden noise outside interrupted her words, the distant sound of horses approaching in the darkness. Matthew's hand dropped from her face as he reached for the rifle. Stay inside, he ordered, all tenderness gone from his voice. Lock the door behind me. Matthew, wait, but he was already moving, checking the rifle one last time before stepping onto the porch. The night was clear, a half moon providing just enough light to make out the shapes of 3 riders approaching the main house. Matthew positioned himself at the edge of the porch, using one of the support posts as partial cover. That's far enough, he called when the riders were within earshot. The horses stopped, and Curtis's voice carried through the darkness. Is that any way to greet old comrades, York? We've come a long way for this reunion. You're wanted men, Matthew replied evenly. Sheriff Miller rode out from Bitter Creek, told me what you did to that barkeeper. Curtis's laugh was ugly in the night air. That old fool should have minded his own business, like you should have at Wounded Knee. You killed innocent people, Matthew said, his grip tightening on the rifle. So did you, Curtis shot back. Only difference is, you got soft afterward. Started believing your own lie about being some kind of hero for trying to stop what couldn't be stopped. Matthew heard movement behind him and tensed, knowing without looking that Grace had disobeyed his order to stay inside. Curtis noticed too. Ah, the pretty business partner is joining us. Good. I was hoping to get better acquainted. Leave her out of this, Matthew warned, raising the rifle to his shoulder. This is between us. Everything all right out here, came another voice from the darkness to Matthew's left. It was Parker, one of the ranch hands, his own rifle visible in the moonlight. On the other side of the house, Gibson, the second hand, also emerged from the shadows, armed and alert. Matthew felt a surge of gratitude for the men's loyalty. Curtis assessed the situation, clearly realizing his advantage had diminished. Seems you've got yourself quite the welcome committee, York. Last chance, Matthew said firmly. Ride away now. Keep riding until you hit the Montana border. Don't come back. For a tense moment, no one moved, then Curtis's hand dropped to his pistol. The crack of Matthew's rifle split the night. Curtis jerked in his saddle, clutching his shoulder as his pistol fell to the ground. Thompson and Wilkins immediately raised their hands, seeing the odds had turned decisively against them. Next one won't be a warning shot, Matthew stated, his voice cold as he reloaded with practiced efficiency. Curtis, grimacing with pain, glared at Matthew with undisguised hatred. You've always been a coward, York. Can't even finish what you start. The sheriff will be by in the morning, Matthew continued, ignoring the taunt. "Parker, Gibson, tie them up in the barn. Make sure Curtis gets a bandage for that shoulder. I want him alive for the hangman." As his ranch hands moved to secure the three men, Matthew finally lowered his rifle and turned to find Grace standing just behind him, her face pale in the moonlight. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Matthew nodded, suddenly exhausted as the tension drained from his body. "I didn't kill him," he said, as if only just realizing it himself. "I could have, but I didn't." Grace's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. "That's what matters. You protected what's important without becoming what you feared." Matthew looked down at the rifle in his hands, the weapon that had once defined him now simply a tool he had used with restraint. "Jacob would have done the same," he murmured. "Yes," Grace agreed, a small smile touching her lips. "He would be proud of you, Matthew. Proud that you finally set it down, metaphorically speaking, long enough to find another way to live." Morning brought Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies to collect Curtis and his companions. The sheriff seemed impressed by Matthew's restraint in merely wounding Curtis rather than killing him outright. "You're a better man than most, York," Miller commented as his deputies loaded the prisoners onto a wagon. "Not sure I'd have been so merciful, given the circumstances." Matthew glanced at Grace, who was speaking with the deputies about the events of the previous night. "I'm trying to be the man my brother thought I was," he replied simply. Miller nodded in understanding. "Well, you won't have to worry about these 3 anymore. After what they did in Bitter Creek, they'll be facing the gallows for sure." After the sheriff and his party departed, an unusual quiet settled over the ranch. Parker and Gibson returned to their regular duties, and Matthew found himself standing on the porch, the rifle once again in his hands. Grace joined him, her presence a comfort he'd grown to rely on. "What will you do with it now?" she asked, nodding toward the weapon. Matthew considered the rifle, turning it over to examine the craftsmanship that had made it such a reliable companion for so many years. "Keep it," he decided, "but not as a weapon, as a reminder." "Of what?" "Of choices," Matthew said. "Of the man I was, the man I became, and the man I'm trying to be now." Grace's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I like the man you are now, Matthew York, very much." Matthew set the rifle down, leaning it against the porch railing so he could turn to face her fully. "Enough to consider making our partnership more permanent." Grace's eyes widened slightly before a slow smile spread across her face. "Are you proposing a merger, Mr. York? Or something more personal?" Matthew took both her hands in his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Both, I think. The ranch needs you, and so do I." "What about Jacob?" Grace asked softly. "Does it feel strange, loving the woman he once loved?" Matthew thought about his brother, about the joy Jacob had found in life despite its hardships, about how he would want both of them to find happiness again. "Jacob brought us together," he said finally. "In his letters to you, in his stories to me. I think perhaps he knew somehow that we would need each other." Grace's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I like to think he'd approve, that he'd want this for us." "I know he would," Matthew assured her, drawing her closer. "He always did have better judgment than me." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, a sensation he'd thought lost to him forever after Wounded Knee, after Jacob's death. But here it was, a new beginning built on the foundation of shared grief and mutual respect that had grown into something beautiful and unexpected. Autumn came to Shoshone with a blaze of color and the promise of a bountiful harvest. The ranch had prospered beyond Matthew's expectations, with the cattle operation expanding and the crops yielding more than enough to see them through the winter with plenty to sell. On a crisp October morning, Matthew stood in the cemetery on the edge of town, Grace's hand firmly in his as they faced Jacob's grave. They had been married the previous day in a simple ceremony attended by the townsfolk who had come to accept and even embrace their unconventional story. Matthew placed a single wildflower on the grave marker, a tradition he had maintained since the burial, but which now felt different, less like an act of penance and more like a gesture of gratitude. "He would have loved the wedding," Grace said, her voice gentle in the morning stillness. "Especially when Mrs. Sullivan cried so loudly the preacher had to pause the ceremony." Matthew chuckled, remembering the moment with fondness rather than the embarrassment he might have felt months earlier. Jacob always did enjoy a good spectacle. They stood in companionable silence for a moment longer before Grace spoke again. "I brought something for him," she said, reaching into her coat pocket. She withdrew a small, polished piece of the rifle's original firing pin, the one Matthew had removed after Wounded Knee and recently replaced with a new one crafted by Harold. Grace placed it carefully atop the grave marker. "A symbol," she explained, seeing Matthew's questioning look. Of promises kept and promises evolved. Matthew felt a surge of emotion as he understood her gesture. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Thank you." As they walked back toward their wagon, Matthew glanced at the rifle secured in its holder. The wood gleamed with fresh oil, and the metal components shone in the autumn sunlight. No trace of rust remained, just as no trace of the crushing guilt that had once defined him remained in his heart. "The cowboy's rifle was rusting from disuse," Grace said, following his gaze. "Do you remember what I said to you that night after Curtis?" Matthew nodded, pulling her close against the morning chill. "You said he'd be proud I finally set it down. Jacob, you meant—" "Yes," Grace confirmed, her green eyes bright with love. Not the physical act of setting down the rifle, but what it represented, letting go of the past that was consuming you, finding a way to honor his memory by living fully rather than merely existing. Matthew helped her into the wagon before climbing up beside her, taking the reins in hands that no longer shook with remembered violence. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "You brought me back to life, Grace York." She smiled at the sound of her new name, leaning against his shoulder as the wagon began to move. "We brought each other back," she corrected gently. "And now we have a future to build together." As they rode back toward their ranch, their home, Matthew felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Wounded Knee. The rifle at his side was no longer a burden but a reminder of the journey he had taken, of the man he had become. A man who had learned that true strength lay not in violence but in restraint, not in isolation but in connection. Jacob would indeed be proud, he thought, not just of the ranch or the life he was building with Grace, but of the brother who had found his way back from darkness into light. The rifle might still be used for hunting or protection when necessary, but its power to define him was gone, rusted away like the metal had been before Harold's careful restoration. And in its place, something new and stronger had grown, a love built on shared grief, but sustained by shared joy, a partnership that honored the past while embracing the future with open arms. Spring arrived the following year with the birth of their son, whom they named Jacob Thomas York, honoring both Matthew's brother and the sheriff who had become a close friend. The baby had Grace's green eyes, and what Matthew insisted was Jacob's smile, though Grace gently pointed out that all babies smiled that way. As Matthew sat on the porch one evening, his son sleeping peacefully in his arms while Grace tended to her expanding garden, he found himself overwhelmed with gratitude for the life he now lived. The ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the county. Their home had expanded to accommodate their growing family, and the rifle that had once symbolized his darkest days now hung above the fireplace, clean, functional, but no longer central to his identity. When Grace joined him on the porch, wiping garden soil from her hands, she noticed the contemplative expression on his face. "Deep thoughts, Mr. York," Matthew smiled up at her, still marveling at how this remarkable woman had chosen to share her life with him. "Just counting my blessings, Mrs. York." Grace settled beside him, gently brushing a finger against their son's soft cheek. "Any particular blessing at the top of your list?" "The day a determined Boston woman showed up at my cabin, claiming to be engaged to my brother," Matthew replied without hesitation. "The day everything changed." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her presence as essential to him now as air. "I was so nervous that night, waiting for you to return. I'd rehearsed what to say, how to explain why I'd come all that way. And then I walked in with that rusty old rifle, looking like I'd already given up on living," Matthew added with a self-deprecating smile. "Not given up," Grace corrected gently. "Just lost your way for a while, we all do sometimes." Matthew shifted the baby slightly, marveling at how perfectly his son fit in the crook of his arm. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Shoshone, if you'd stayed in Boston after your father passed? Grace considered the question, her eyes on the horizon where the setting sun painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Sometimes, she admitted. But then, I remember something Jacob wrote in his last letter to me. He said that life's paths aren't always straight or clear, but if we follow our hearts with courage, they'll lead us where we're meant to be. Matthew felt a familiar warmth at the mention of his brother, but without the accompanying ache that had once been inevitable. He always did have a way with words. It runs in the family, Grace teased, pressing a kiss to his weathered cheek. Your letters to me when I was visiting my sister last winter were positively poetic. Matthew chuckled, remembering the desperate loneliness of those 2 weeks without her. I meant every word. As darkness settled over the ranch and they prepared to go inside, Matthew cast one last glance at the rifle mounted above the fireplace, visible through the open door. No longer a symbol of what he had lost, but a reminder of what he had found: redemption, purpose, love. The cowboy's rifle had rusted from disuse, and a wise woman had told him his brother would be proud he'd finally set it down. But the true victory wasn't in setting down the weapon itself. It was in setting down the burden of guilt and regret he'd carried for so long, making room in his heart for the future that now slept peacefully in his arms. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, its voice echoing across the Wyoming plains. Matthew York, once defined by death and loss, now embraced life with both arms, one holding his son, the other wrapped securely around the woman who had saved him simply by believing he was worth saving. And somewhere, he liked to think, Jacob was smiling.